Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the DevOps Summit today. Uh, Today's discussion is going to be around cybersecurity for this particular topic and just some of the challenges around cybersecurity in general. Obviously, everybody's hearing a lot in the news about what's happening. There's some really big events that are happening in the world today. And so today's discussion is really around what is the challenge around cybersecurity, and just to really look at the enormity of the challenge that we actually have in there. What I was so for me, like I'm always working with organizations to try to help build strategies and to help them to figure out how they can defeat, the enemy in terms of, the challenges around the risks that they have with their organizations. So today's topics are going to be around the challenges around cybersecurity, what's happening in the world in terms of the events that we're hearing, and also what you need to do about it as well, which is really building a proper cybersecurity strategic plan. Some of the sources that I borrowed from, I read voraciously about this industry and have done for a very long time. They come from Verizon, the Parliament Institute. There was a book I read called Future Crimes. I actually had the good fortune of meeting the author of that book, who was ex-Secret Service, FBI, and many other things. And a lot of it comes from personal experience as well. So I actually started out in this business in around 1993. My first interest in cybersecurity, really, it wasn't called that at the time, of course. It was just really computer security. It was around the viruses. I read a book from Norton Antivirus at the time that had written about where most of these viruses were coming from, and it was from a country called Bulgaria. The interesting thing they said was that the reason why these guys were the heaviest producers of viruses is because they had a country full of very talented code writers, but they had nothing to do. So you think about that in contrast with today, where there's a lot of good code writers with something to do and are actually making a lot of money out of it as well. I was voted, I was actually published last year several times, but one of them was for the top 100 global thought leader for 2020. I'm on the Global Advisory Board. I'm also on a North American think tank for cybersecurity. I've always involved myself in a lot of things that are going on in the industry because I have a real passion for it. I've always have been developing my expertise, not just so much around technology and just, network architecture and infrastructure, but really what's going on under the hood from a global perspective, because there are really a lot of challenges out there. I have my government Canada secret clearance. I've done a lot of very cool stuff with them, and just generally keeping myself busy in the industry. I always like to start off with, who my major influences are in this business, because they've actually helped to guide what my understanding of this business is. I read Sun Tzu's The Art of War back in the mid-90s. And what I learned from that actually is it's not just a book of warfare, it's actually it's a philosophical view of how you should really treat different scenarios. And I actually learned how to create, apart from my network engineering background, how to create secure networks, because in the 90s, I was trying to perfect my hacking skills and use that as part of the business to help customers to understand where their risks were, but also how to create secure designs by learning to understand what the enemy is really up to, what are the bad guys doing. And so it helps you to understand and inform you how you can actually combat these things. Really, and I've read this book probably about 10 to 12 times ever since. One of the things that I didn't know actually with my research a little while back was there was a gentleman by the name of Philippe Scolari. He actually was the manager of both the Portuguese and the Brazilian World Cup winning soccer teams. For anybody in that business to be able to win the soccer World Cup in the first place would be an absolute phenomenon, but to win it twice. But he accredited this to reading Sun Tzu's The Art of War. So the point being is it's basically a philosophy on anything you can attribute it to. And then the other one was Kevin Mitnick. I read his book back in 2001, The Art of Deception. Up until that point, I always thought that really, the hack was really a technical thing, but it actually turns out that it wasn't. Like in Kevin's case, like he'd be able to shortcut, hacking that he was doing from weeks to days by just calling somebody up and using social engineering to make them do things that they're not supposed to do. A lot of that is because they weren't trained, there weren't policies, and there really wasn't just a understanding of that type of social engineering back then. But as we can see today, social engineering is really a problem for us, and it continues to be a way for organizations to get breached. Is simply by tricking people into doing things they're not supposed to. And so when I learned about this back in 2001, it really changed my understanding of this industry as well, because I suddenly realized that there's more at stake here than just trying to figure out who's trying to hack the firewall. I'm a big proponent of Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Anybody that I know in this business that have very high level responsibilities in different countries, this is part of their reading material. Actually, everybody I've ever spoken to has a copy of this. Which is comforting to know. Actually, that a lot of people seem to have the same opinion about its use. In Canada, actually, so some colleges, it's actually recommended reading as well. It's not just a nice to have. One of his sayings is, if you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. What he was saying in that I interpreted was, if I understand what it is that they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing, it helps me to understand how to protect my organization. What is it that I have that they would be interested in? With that, I'd be able to, protect my organization better. I've worked for companies that have, hundreds and hundreds, almost 1,000 locations within their environment, and trying to protect organizations that large is really, really a challenge. So one of the two, I guess, when you take a very difficult, complicated business like we're in, try to distill it into things that people can understand. You try to come up with ways to sort of explain things that you don't need to go into big, complex explanations about. One of the things that I've learned to understand over the years in doing this is that what companies really need to do is become experts of what they do when it comes to cybersecurity. There's no way that you're ever going to learn to be an expert in what they do, what the other guys are doing. Their expertise and their invention, it really knows no limits, and we see this all the time. But the thing is if you can learn to understand what you need to do and become an expert at that, it's going to go a long way to helping to protect your organization. Nobody's saying that whatever you do is ever going to be bulletproof and panacea for keeping these guys out. But the idea is that you try to make it as difficult as possible for these criminal organizations and other actors to be able to break into your organization. And the idea around that is you need to really build a strategic plan. The strategic plans are really built on industry best practices. These industry best practices are built already. There's nothing for you to have to do. There's no sitting around and trying to figure things out. These practices are already built and ready for use and are already in use by large organizations. Where they're not really in use a lot is in the small to medium-sized companies, because a lot of times they don't have the resources, they don't have the budgets to be able to align to things like that. But it really can be a game changer or even a lifesaver for a business to follow these best practices. There's not really a lot written on the Canadian experience when it comes to cybersecurity and the challenges around it. It's sort of more of a general type scenario, but there was a report that came out a couple of years ago by CDW. What was interesting about it was they actually were able to, using even statistics from Statistics Canada, interestingly, they were able to marry together some information that really told the story about the Canadian landscape. And really what they were able to find were, they were on average about 1 in 5 companies. I think at the time we had about 1.3 million, or just under, that active businesses in Canada. So when you think about 260,000 businesses, this is 2019 actually as well, being taken down by ransomware with a population of 1.3 million. We're looking at, and even in today's numbers would be in the hundreds of thousands being taken down by ransomware. That's a massive number of companies to be affected by something so, so common. And honestly, in a lot of cases, it's probably very easily remediated with the right practices. The worst thing about that particular number was that 20% of these businesses were actually reinfected after the original breach. So having gone through the cleanup, recovery, restores, running backups and everything, 80% of those, 20% of those companies are actually affected by the same ransomware again. And there's lots of reasons why that happens, which we can cover more in a later section. If we look about the way the evolution has gone in this business, and having luckily been in the business as long as I have, you've seen the trend and you've seen the way things develop over time. You start to understand kind of a bigger picture of really what's going on. And one of the things that I learned to understand about the way where we're at in this particular stage of our development in cybersecurity is that, as Sun Tzu said, you need to take the high ground if you're going to go into combat with your enemy. And we use that phrase commonly for lots and lots of different things. Well, really, the idea is that we don't have the high ground. The enemy has had the high ground for decades, and we've never had that high ground. We're constantly running up that hill trying to take the high ground right now, and sustaining casualties on a massive scale at the moment. These next two diagrams are a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it was really just to simplify what we used to have and what we have today. The traditional perimeter approach that we used to have was very symmetrical. It was very easy to understand. The bad guys on the outside, good guys on the inside, and firewall in between. All was good. But in today's world, we are living in a multi-dimensional and asymmetrical problem with cybersecurity, because the level of invention, as I mentioned earlier, with cybersecurity criminals, they know no limits to their invention. Whatever you think that you're doing in terms of your practices currently are not really going to work. One of the interesting things about the statistics around hundreds of thousands of companies being hit by ransomware is that you can basically go to any of these companies and ask them, what do they have for firewalls and endpoint solutions and all the other security technologies, and they're all going to tell you they have the best. And they're probably also going to tell you that, prior to being hit, was that they were never breached, and so they must have been doing something okay. But in most of these cases, it's just simply because organizations really don't understand where the risks are, where the challenges are, where are the areas where these guys could get into your organization. I created this diagram many years ago, and one of the images in here is the drone, and it's actually very prescient, as I'll show you later. So talking about ransomware. Ransomware is obviously very pervasive. There's obviously the reason why people do this is because it makes them lots of money. We're headed for somewhere in the neighborhood of about $6 trillion in losses this year. One of the things I've also noted that I keep hearing over and over now is that people are saying, cyber threats are kind of top of mind for businesses and for governments. And for people who have been in this business a long time, when you're hearing something like that, it's kind of strange because the threat's been growing for decades. Companies have been losing hundreds of millions of dollars back in the 90s, and so we didn't go from being losing a couple of bucks 2 years ago to all of a sudden $6 trillion this year. It's been growing over a very long time, and it's just very unfortunate just the way things are. But hopefully the trend will be towards actually fixing this. The way it started out was just really around encrypting your hard drives and making access to your information basically impossible. Over time, the way they developed these ways of doing things also include what we call the triple threat. I don't really hear people using that terminology anymore, but the triple threat really was basically I infect your systems, I elevate my privileges to get to super admin, and then steal your data, and then have your files encrypted. Those are the three things, and this is a very common thing nowadays. It started off with Riek. They were the guys I think that was first started doing this, and then every other ransomware gang has kind of taken that up now, because if people aren't paying the ransoms, at least they can make money off of your data. One of the quotes I always usually explain to people when I'm doing these presentations is that you literally can spend millions of dollars on cybersecurity technology, but you'll always be defeated by the end user with one click. There are a lot of technical reasons why this happens, but one of the major reasons really is because the end user doesn't really get the training on cybersecurity and what the threats are, which is a real problem because that's your biggest asset right there. There's not enough technology that you can put into place to actually make sure the users can be protected from these things. They really need to understand what the risks are, how to identify them, what the process and procedure is for actually dealing with that, which is something that's very rare still. There are organizations that are taking this on and are doing a really good job of it, but it's still not enough of it being done. It's too easy for cyber criminals to infiltrate your organization through this methodology. I'm a copious reader of this business, as well as being a hands-on guy in this business, and really learn this industry from the ground up. But I was kind of taken aback when I read this report from the World Economic Forum that actually described how cybersecurity has actually become a global risk and has made it into the clear and present danger category. I don't know whether to pat people on the back or just start freaking out, because they honestly think that this is a real threat to our way of life, which it really is. I mean, you've seen indications and examples of how a water treatment plant was accessed in Florida, the pipeline incident, and the list goes on and on and on. And so when it comes to things where lives are at risk, especially if you're taking down an entire hospital that's treating very sick patients with the risk of losing them because of that, it's no wonder that we actually made it into that top list. And they're seeing that this is going to be a potential for the next 10 years. It's not something that's coming and going away within a year or two. The next 10 years, it's going to be reaching levels that we haven't even seen just yet, according to their predictions. One of the other research organizations that I refer to always is the Parliament Institute. They do what they call the activity-based costing when it comes to breaches. And so they look at, who's involved in a post-cleanup breach scenario, lawyers, insurance, the time and effort for people that are actually throwing themselves into the breach in order to clean up the activity, to clean up the mess that's been created by these malware incidents. And so, when you average out the cost of those things, they can come out with a sort of a rough estimate of how much an average breach would be. And it's in and around, it's in the millions for an average company. In fact, it's around about 3.86 million. If you're looking at US as an example, the highest was the US. Healthcare industry actually was paid out the most. But one of the interesting facts within here is it takes around about 280 days for somebody to identify and eradicate a malware infection or a breach even with an organization. And our past tests that we've done with pen testing with organizations, we've been able to prove that we can literally own your network in a day. And so that gives us 279 days to do a lot of damage within organizations. And I'd say even the 280 days is generous. I think in a lot of cases, most companies will never realize that they've been breached, as was the case with Northern Telecom, actually, where they had infiltrations that lasted for over 10 years. This is the statistics over the last few years in terms of the breach identification. You can see at one point it was quite high in 2015. It started to drop down a little bit over the years after that, but it's been steadily increasing again. This is really is a problem, because what this tells us is that organizations do not have the security awareness that they need in order to detect the types of breaches that are going on in their organization. So, when I hear companies say, well, we've never been breached, so we must be good, I'm always very skeptical, because the thing is that you would never know. These guys don't show up with a mariachi band, and a marching band and a vuvuzela to announce the fact that they're actually in your network. The whole point of it is for them to work in a stealthy mode, to be able to map your networks, to understand what you have for intellectual property, what you have for databases. And in a lot of cases too, they'll learn to understand your payment processing. Who does that? Who approves it? What is the mechanisms for making payments? Who are the destination companies? And if I have access to your databases and I can change account numbers in there for legitimate partners that you normally pay on a regular basis, all of a sudden now you're paying to people that you don't know, but you don't know that you're doing that because, so long it looks legit. And we have this concept of anything that's inside of a network is trusted by nature. And so anything that you use, or people that you connect with and communicate with them on an everyday basis within the organization is considered trusted. And just there's lots of examples of this. You know, the Bank of Bangladesh, if you look that up, you know, it's hundreds of millions of dollars that they lost. But closer to home, the city of Burlington actually lost $500,000 through this same process. And so it's a very, very common thing. I've seen lots of examples of this. And all it comes down to is just not following industry best practices. These are sort of a little bit of a breakdown of the way or the types of things that are being stolen once people get inside to your environments. Customer PII is huge. You know, there's so much of it ends up on the dark web, and you know, varying levels of pricing for what people can buy from you. But if you think about us, we're kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. You know, the more pieces you can put together of the way we look or who we are as an individual, the more likely that you're going to suffer identity theft, just because of piecing together all of these different things that you know they can get about you. And so it really is a huge concern and growing very much all the time. Verizon's another publication that comes out every year. I've been reading it for the last 15 years. I do a lot of tremendous research around the data that they collect in there. Over 80% of breaches within hacking involve brute force, lost or stolen credentials. The brute forcing is an interesting thing because nowadays, because there are so many credentials available on the darknet, instead of just sort of guessing at what those credentials potentially might be, you know, this is literally a harvest of real credentials that are actually being stolen all the time and have a very high likelihood of being used to breach an organization. This statistic is a couple of years old as well. Was research by the National Cybersecurity Alliance. 60% of small businesses go out of business after 6 months after suffering a major breach. And so it's not difficult to understand why this might be. I mean, there's lots of examples that you can use, but you know, if you think about it in simple, I've actually seen this for myself. If I'm a 10-person company and I have a multi-million-dollar contract with, you know, one of the major global organizations around the world, and I suffer a major cyber attack where I lose your IP or I lose access to information that's sensitive to the organization I'm working with, you're not really going to survive that as a small business. And you think about it, what you're doing is probably something very niche and would appeal to a lot of different organizations, but you know, with a reputation of not protecting that data in the manner that was expected of you, is not going to carry well for anybody that you might be looking to do business with to replace any contracts that you've lost. And so this is one of the examples of how these businesses go out of business because they just don't have the means to survive them, and it happens way too many times. And these statistics are 2 years old as well, so you can imagine that you know the losses that have since been taken. And if you add COVID to that particular scenario, it's a very, very difficult time for a lot of these organizations. One of the areas that I have an interest in as well as the cyber warfare type thing is really understanding these organizations. You know, who are they? How do they actually work? What are they actually doing behind the scenes? You know, what are the motivations around what they do? And so we all know that crime as a service is a thing and has been for some time now. But what a lot of people don't really know is the web as we know it only occupies about 4%. You know, if this is where the criminals live, is in the rest of the internet as depicted in this picture. It's been widely used in a lot of places. Again, this is a couple of years old that I had this, but really nothing has changed in that respect. This is an example of one of the websites. If you're able to get access to the dark web and able to go and find, an example of what the sorts of things that you can buy off of here. Just to be clear, in the dark web, there is no such thing as an indexable search capability. You can't go in there and say, find me the drugs near me, like you can do with Google, because the dark web and the deep web are not indexed. Like there is no way for you to just do a search to find what you're looking for. There's lots of ways that you have to go through to actually find these sites, but and they usually start with chat rooms. And and also if you know people as well. So it's not easy to actually find these places, and it takes an extensive amount of research to be able to do so. But this is an example of how they're actually putting up the way these websites look to make it easy for you to buy and purchase different things from them. And you can see there's some examples of some benign things like jewels and gold, but there's also software and malware counterfeit items, drugs, chemicals, and the list goes on and on and on. In terms of the way cyber criminals are organized, the thing that differs between them and what we do is that they're pretty much highly organized, they're highly structured, they're highly motivated, and they're highly financed as well. And one of the things you'll never hear from these guys is that we don't have budget for this, because the money they make from what they do is pretty extensive, and they plow that back into making sure that their campaigns and development of new malware is well financed, and to allow them to provide success. This is something that I didn't download off the internet. I actually pieced this together based on some research that I had done about some of these criminal organizations. They pretty much look the same way as a regular organization. They have CEOs and chief financial officers to make sure that everybody that's involved in their enterprise gets paid on time, HR for recruiting. One of the interesting areas that I discovered here is, and kind of explain one of the things that I and a lot of people have always known about for a long time, is you have the coding engineers and the QA department. The QA department is designed to make sure that any malware that's created by the code developers is actually tested against all of the major antivirus vendors in the world to make sure that they wouldn't be detected by that. And so this goes through a very rigorous testing procedure, and that's how we end up with the 0-day scenario, because this malware has already been tested. It's not created and thrown out there in the hopes that it's going to work. It actually is. There is a process for doing this, and so there's so many different levels to the way they're built. If you've ever seen those adverts for making $1,000 a week working from home, the likelihood is it's connected to a criminal organization like this. Talking about what's going on in the world, the SolarWinds hack. The interesting thing about these for me is, and I've seen a lot of people writing about of how it happened, and who potentially did it. But one of the things that always interests me is the fact that nobody picked up on it. One account says that by the end of 2020 was when it was first detected, and it had been in there for a few months before, infecting organizations and allowing these cyber criminals or even nation state actors to be able to access a lot of these different organizations. At one account I'd also read more recently was the actual infection took place in and around the early 2019s. And so to me, that's a real problem. It's a much bigger problem than the way it's being depicted, because these, whoever they are, still to be determined, even though there is real evidence as to who it might be. It's pretty unbelievable that nobody detected the presence of these people within their networks. That's the thing that's most concerning for me, because we're spending millions and millions, probably hundreds of millions of dollars on all this great security technology, and yet none of it is capable of picking out the presence of these things. And it's not because of, I think, the failure of the technology, it's a failure of the process. It usually is always a failure of process. If you're not checking these systems to make sure they're actually doing what they're doing, you're not analyzing the results that these systems are providing in terms of all of the logging information that they're capable of providing, you're never going to pick up on the activity within your networks. And so this goes back to the reason why I always use Sun Tzu as my guide, is that apparently these people don't really understand themselves very much. And that's a problem, because if you don't understand your organization, and yet your attackers understand your organization better than you, they're always going to win. And so again, coming back to industry best practices, this is the reason why we need to move towards that. I talked about buying credentials and the brute forcing of information earlier on. Unfortunately, the CRA was a classic example of what happens when cyber criminals are able to buy, great libraries fulls of credentials off the dark web. And they use this thing called credential stuffing, where they basically use a script. You put all these credentials in there, and it will scan the entire digital universe, looking for matches to those usernames and passwords that they discovered. The CRA, they had to lock out over 800,000 Canadians. There were tens of thousands of accounts that were breached simply because people were using the same credentials, not just for their CRA account, but for Facebook and Twitter and every other online presence that they particularly may have. This is another unfortunate scenario that we have, is that people are using the same credentials over and over and over again. It really is a major problem. The solutions around this really is to use, a password manager, like a password vault. I ended up using one I started a few years ago because there was just too many accounts. There's no way you can remember passwords for over 200 different accounts like I had. So you need something that can help you to organize that. But the other aspect of this was, yes, on the one side, it was sort of self-inflicted because these users were using the same credentials. But on the other side, really the CRA should have been using multi-factor authentication for years. Their excuse was that the adoption of this was very slow. Well, the banks have managed it for years, so I don't really understand how that's even an excuse. I actually know that they've been discussing the idea of using multi-factor for years, based on an event that I was at a few years ago. But all of a sudden, because of this breach, multi-factor is now a part of that, where it could have been for years and have avoided this in the first place. I mentioned about the drone that was in my image. This was something I had added recently. This is a real thing. This actually is a wireless aerial surveillance platform, and it could be AI driven. And it basically, you can sit and fly it up to the 40th floor or 60th floor of a building and just have it sit there and use AI automation to be able to crack into wireless networks, anything it could be used as a cell tower to intercept your cell service as well, and can sit there for as long as the power will allow it to do that. And it can run through everything that a human would normally do. If it happens to find a lot of data from there, it can transmit that to AWS or Azure or some other cloud service somewhere else for storage. Especially if it's usernames and passwords, they can send it to a storage area or a platform where there's applications that can run cracking against these things at an exponential rate. And no human needs to be involved in this. And so the idea of being able to fly these things towards buildings, it's going to really present another area of difficulty when it comes to managing risk for organizations. And there are other examples where these have actually been in use. One of the things that's not really well known is that the whole world is really mapped. The whole world is really cataloged. Like, nobody's sitting around wondering, what's Ken Muir up to today? I'm going to go and check out his router. Every single device that's internet facing in this world has already been mapped by the cyber criminals. They run scanning technologies all the time, looking for weaknesses within organizations. And unfortunately, they take this information and put them in a way that's publicly available. This is an example of what I'm talking about. If you go to the showdown.io site, you can create very, very simple searches looking for things that you could put in an organization's name, for instance. It will come up and show you whatever weaknesses that particular organization might have. And in a lot of cases, they have RDP, which is the remote desktop protocol, available on the internet for lots and lots of companies. In fact, the Verizon report a couple of years ago actually proved that 50% of ransomware breaches were actually caused by organizations that had RDP exposed to the internet. And so that's a real problem. Only around 20% was actually people clicking on links, which was very surprising. But this is a site that's publicly available. You can go in there and set up an account at any time. So what I did for the example of here was I actually put in the word camera just to pull up internet cameras that were available on the internet. This is the IP address. This is just a random selection. I took this IP address, I put it into my web browser. Up came the login prompt. I discovered what kind of camera it was, looked for the default usernames, passwords, and I put that in there, and this is the image that came up in there. Now, the frightening thing with this is that because this is so easily available, and this is available en masse all over the world, if I was a predator, I could literally sit there and look and discover your pattern of life. I could watch you going in and out. I can discover who you are. Are you a family? Are you a couple? Are you a single person? I could sit there for days learning about your pattern of life. If I was an ill-intentioned person. One of the other things that I did was with the IP address was to kind of do a geo lookup to discover where in the world this camera actually was. And then I did a logical drive around to try and figure out where this building was that housed this camera. And so that's how easily it was. This took me about 10 minutes to do this. And there's so many ways that these criminal enterprises are able to learn about individuals and to track down individuals. Unfortunately, so are the predators amongst us have also figured out that this is a way to find people, along with the telemetry that you can get from photography. This little guy here is the reason why you never access your bank or corporate information while you're in a coffee shop. It's called a pineapple, and it basically can act as a wireless network for you when you're sitting in the store. It can actually act as a cell tower as well to pick up your communications and act as what we call a man-in-the-middle attack. So you think that you're connecting directly to a destination that you've chosen on there, but what you're actually doing is connecting to this little device here, which in turn is connecting to the destination that you're going to. One of the real problem areas is, when we type in CNN.com, for instance, what we should be typing in is https:// CNN, www or CNN.com. But for convenience, we just type that in, and usually what that initiates is an unencrypted session. And for your convenience, the destination, whoever it is you're connecting to, as a convenience, will then switch your communications over to an encrypted session. The irony here is that this actually would pick up that unencrypted session and maintain that session while you're in the coffee shop, and encrypting the session at the other end. So anything that you're typing in could be picked up, your usernames, passwords, anything that you're doing for work, emails, all that type of stuff. So this is the reason why you never want to do that. I'm not going to go too much into this, but there's some pretty drastic changes coming to Canadian law in the next couple of years. Anybody that's not following along in privacy protections could face fines from anywhere from $10 to $25 million. It's still being proposed at the moment. There's nothing finalized just yet, but keep an eye out for this over the next couple of years, because without proper practices around securing data, this could really cost companies a lot of money. This is where I get to the section around what it is you can actually do about this scenario. My talks that I usually do really are around the magnitude of the problem that we have for cybersecurity. It's a lot to have to deal with. And so if you're using industry best practices in terms of what we would call the industry standards and frameworks, there's a number of them. If you basically follow what they prescribe and what they suggest that you should do, you can go a long way to actually protecting your organizations. And it's something that you can get your head around and actually learn to become experts at, and will help you to reduce that. And it's not expensive. That's the one thing I always try to emphasize with organizations. It's not expensive to introduce good practices. We've got enough technologies today. There's enough ways of doing the right things for your organization that even your in-house IT people can take care of if they learn to understand what it is that's required for them. And what you need to do is you need to create a strategic roadmap and a structured and a prioritized approach to remediation and sort of development of that particular plan. One of the ones that we always recommend, particularly here in Canada, is the CIS, which is the Center for Internet Security. They have a framework that's been around for many, many years. The categories that are in here, there's around 18 of them. And what these are describing is these are the things that you should be doing in your organization. These are the areas where the cyber criminals, nation states, this is what they're looking at as well. They're looking for weaknesses within all of these different categories that your organization might have. For instance, if you're not doing penetration testing, that's an area where the cyber criminals are doing pen testing all the time. They're learning to figure out where your weaknesses are within your organization, so they can actually take what they've learned and actually use that as a way to exploit and get into your organization. Having an understanding of where your assets are, doing proper backup management, for instance, as I explained before, what these criminals are doing is they know that you back up your data on a weekly, bi-weekly, maybe every day. And for them, what they do is they're not going to trigger ransomware as soon as they infect your organization. What they do is they'll wait, weeks, hoping that the amount of backups that you've done will complete its cycle. So what ends up happening is you recover from a ransomware attack by using your backups, and you find that those are infected as well. And so that speaks to the statistic that I mentioned earlier about the fact that these organizations, 20% of the 80% that were hit get reinfected even after the initial cleanup. And this is partly the reason why, is because the backups are also infected as well. More lately, what they're doing is they're actually deleting your backups. So making sure that you have offline backups too is very important. But all of these things that are described in here, these are all the things that you should be doing as an organization. One of the things that we've been able to pull out from particularly the CIS controls is what they call foundational controls. So if you're a small organization, you don't have the means to be able to go through all of these, what you can do is, at a minimum, these are the things that you should be looking at. A security awareness training, I cannot stress how important that one particular thing is because, as I mentioned before, if your end users are not familiar with the risks associated with cybersecurity, they're not going to be as much help to you. In fact, they're going to be a detriment. And so it's really your responsibility as an organization to make sure that they're well trained. But all of the things that are here are designed to make sure that your business is as secure as it can be based on minimum controls. And really the approach is very simple. You need to do an assessment of your organization to find out where you're at compared with what the industry is recommending. You move into a remediation state where you implement technologies, processes, and policies, as well as some written documentation around how you're going to secure your environment. And then you move that into kind of a governance model, which, at its basic is really just making sure that all of this stuff is working and somebody is managing and maintaining it. And then, one of the last things that we typically use is the common maturity model. It's really a way to measure where you're at as an organization compared with where you should be. 5 is probably is the highest level that you could achieve. It's sort of where you're a bank, financial institution, insurance company. These sorts of people, this is where they need to be. For everyone else, most organizations, especially from a resource budgeting perspective, getting to a 3 or a 4 would be very acceptable. And that's usually where we start. But on average, when we do these, most organizations are not even at a 1. They're anywhere from a 0.5 to a 0.8 in terms of their level of maturity. It may sound bad, but it's a good place to start, because what we're looking for is a baselining of where you're at to figure out we're going to get you to where you need to be. And that's that. I'll just leave you with this summary. Thank you so much for listening today. I appreciate it.